But even for girls who were poorer or who were working class and who had to perhaps work outside, physically to help their families get along, were expected to comport themselves in certain feminized ways, which impressed upon them the need to control their bodies, to kind of pull it all in, right? And to move with a sense of modesty, and to not relish the outdoors. Having to go is one thing, but going out, running as hard as you can, pumping your legs, throwing your arms out, getting dirty, getting messy, certainly not encouraged for girls.
Hello, good evening. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, and I am delighted to be hosting tonight's event with American historian Tiya Miles and kicking off the 2023 Boston Book Festival. Now, I'm a founding board member of the Boston Book Festival, and I still sit on the board, so that's near and dear to my heart. And I hope that all of you will mark Friday, October 14th, the start of the festival, on your calendar. You'll hear from dozens of creatives, change makers, New York Times bestsellers, award winners, and amazing storytellers, including our guest this evening. Let me introduce Tiya Miles, a public historian and creative writer whose research focuses on African American, Native American, and women's history during colonial America. Miles is the author of 7 books and the only current 2-time winner of Yale's Frederick Douglass Prize for the study of slavery, abolition, and resistance. All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, first published in 2021, won 11 prizes, including the National Book Award for Nonfiction. All That She Carried was a New York Times bestseller and was selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the Washington Post, Slate, Vulture, and picked as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, NPR, Time, the Boston Globe, and many more. Now, her latest book, Wild Girls: How the Outdoors Shaped the Women Who Challenged a Nation, explores ecological questions, environmental storytelling, and the women who trailblazed the 19th and early 20th centuries, navigating the woods, following the stars, playing sports, and taking to the streets in peaceful protest along the techniques to resist assimilation, racism, and sexism. Welcome to Beyond the Page, Tiya Miles.
Thank you, Callie. I'm really happy to be here.
Well,
hello, everyone.
Oh, yes. I'm delighted to have you. You got me in the early part of the book because you have a poem by Lucille Clifton, my favorite poet. And the poem is The Earth is a Living Thing, which I love. Great way to set up the book. And so I want to compliment you on that and just say it's a great poem and people should know more about Lucille Clifton. So there you have it. So we're off to a good start.
All right.
Well, let's start with what inspired you to write this book.
I've been noticing that many people have a COVID book that they had started working on during the pandemic or that they produced during the pandemic. And this ends up being my COVID book. I'm not so sure that I realized it at the time, but I see it very clearly now that when we all suddenly started to learn about the mystery and severity of this new illness, and we all had to turn our lives around and really kind of buckle down and even lock down and live from home, it was life-changing, and it threw many of us into a state of confusion and discombobulation. And that includes me. Even at that time, I had been teaching on campus. I had 3 kids who were going to school outside of the home. And, on the turn of a dime, I was teaching from home. So was my husband, and our 3 kids were learning from home. And so it's almost as if every room in our house became a classroom. And during that time, our family, we went through many struggles, as many families did, as family members, were getting sick in different parts of the country. And for us, it almost became a lifeline that we could go outside. We are fortunate enough to have a home, to have a yard, to live on a street that has beautiful old growth trees and where people keep gardens. And that yard was our saving grace. Two of those children under the roof at that time were teenagers, twin teenagers. And they definitely needed to go outside and kind of spend that energy and express those emotions. In fact, this is something that comes to mind as I'm answering this, Callie. I remember that a neighbor of ours had a couple of young women in the home, teenagers and first-year college students. And I remember that those girls would go out there and just kind of not just talk on the phone to friends, but scream and fight and just kind of just let it out, because it was such a difficult time for all of us, and I think especially for young people. And even as I was being so grateful for having our outside space, I realized this, when I think about this now, I almost can't believe it that it took me this long, Callie. It's a shame that it took me this long. But I realized how fortunate we are, because not everybody had a yard that they could go outside with their kids in that space, or they could send their kids outside. And this was a time when the city parks were closed. Some folks who are in Zoom space right now who have kids might remember that. That was a memorable day when the signs came up on the playground area of the parks saying that the kids couldn't play there. And so when I realized what a great privilege it was that we had this space, it really made me think so much more about outdoor space as a public good, outdoor space as something that we all need and that we should all have access to, and how the lack of that access can have detrimental effects on families and on children. And that was the environment in which I decided to write this book and started doing the research.
Now, how did you end up focusing on your three main stories? What led you to the stories that you used to illustrate, including one that focuses on Harriet Tubman? If people know anything about Harriet Tubman, they do know that she had a very, very close relationship to the earth and the outside. I mean, that was her way of staying free from the enslavement.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The book focuses on girls outdoors, mostly in the 19th century. And it's bookended by my sharing of some of my own experiences growing up as a girl who spent time outdoors, but who didn't really think of myself as an outdoorsy kid. That just wasn't a part of my vocabulary. That all felt very distant from my life. But I just loved listening to the wind and feeling the sun and sitting under a tree. And so there are some personal memoir-like aspects at the beginning and end of the book. And the conclusion of the book goes into some 20th century figures, some women authors and activists who had also been girls who spent formative years of their lives outdoors. And so the bulk of the material is really rooted in the 19th century. And as you said, there are three main sections and kind of three main stories that I follow while interweaving additional stories into those. The first chapter, as you mentioned, really focuses on Harriet Tubman, but also opens up to look at other enslaved girls and also white abolitionist women. The second chapter focuses on Louisa May Alcott, but opens up to consider other women who I consider to be nature writers of a certain kind, writing about the environment of the natural world, but also the nature of our societal relations. And the third chapter focuses on an Indigenous girls basketball team in Montana at what was known as the Fort Shaw Indian School. And I arrived at these three stories really because in some way, shape, or form, they've been on my mind for a long time. This book started with Harriet Tubman. Once I knew I wanted to write a book about girls outdoors, Harriet Tubman was the obvious go-to figure for the reasons that you said. I had been interested in her life outside for a long time, for the way in which she would have navigated her environment. I never really had the chance to research that or to dig deeply into that. And so I started with Harriet Tubman, and once I began to see her orientation toward the outdoors, other girls from the past, other examples started coming to mind. Louisa May Alcott, for me, was actually a wild card. And no pun intended there, but she was a wild card. How she got into the book is still a surprise to me. So I had read Little Women many years ago when I was in high school. And at that time, I remember enjoying the book and being excited when I ended up, it's a long story, but ended up going to school in the same town as Orchard House. But then I put Little Women away and didn't think about it for years. Well, during the pandemic, I really had an urge one weekend to just get my family out of the house and to have us see something different, be somewhere different. And for some reason, I thought we should go to Concord and go to Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House. I cannot tell you why, Callie. I do not know why that thought came to me. But we piled into the car and we went. And of course, the House Museum was closed because of COVID. But we walked around outside and we read the signs. We peered into the windows. We looked at the garden that they had replicated there. And I really stood at the site with my kids and just kind of looked around, looked at the environment, looked at the trees, recognized that Walden Pond wasn't too far away. And that's when I thought, Louisa May Alcott.
Well, some would say and have said that the earth has a kind of spirituality about it. So some might suggest you were led spiritually because of your own connection to the earth, which, by the way, came well before the pandemic, because part of the book really talks about your outdoors experience growing up. So share how that became important to include in this book.
Sure, yeah. And I also want to just kind of apologize in advance to the audience. I am actually sick right now. I have COVID right now, and I'm crossing my fingers that I won't have a coughing spell, but I kind of feel one coming on. So if I go on mute for a second, you all, that is the reason why. Yeah, I mean, I remember so many moments outside when I was growing up, Callie, that were powerful and that were important and that were arresting and that were comforting. But when I was a kid, I didn't think of it that way. Looking back, I can recognize that in the various places where I lived, and my parents divorced when I was very young. For a time, my mother and I lived with my grandparents, and then my father remarried. So I had different households, and I was visiting these different households. And in all the different places where I lived, I would always have a favorite tree that I would spend time with, or a favorite bush that I would, get up under with my book, or a favorite shrub that I would just go and hide out, from my dear beloved younger siblings behind. And I think that I felt a sense of just peace and quiet and rightness and the ability to be with my own thoughts and to think creatively outside. And in many ways, I don't think they even realized my parents and my grandparents facilitated that. So my grandmother was a committed porch sitter. My grandmother loved her porch. She would be out there, from the minute it was even slightly warm, to the time I couldn't bear it anymore because it's getting too cold. And she would just be visiting with people or watching the neighborhood and telling me stories. And her garden was right on the hill next to her house. And we would go out and pick the green beans, and we'd come onto our porch and we'd snap them. So I spent so many of my growing up years just outside with my grandmother, listening to her, watching her take care of her flowers. I remember that she used to keep her beverage in a jar and keep the lid on because of the insects and the bees that would love to come and buy her lemonade. And my dad and my stepmother, who I spent a lot of time with over the summers especially, every summer they would try to take us, that's me and my younger brother and sister, to some kind of a state park. We would go to someplace in Ohio or Kentucky, someplace on a short drive, and we would stay overnight. And we weren't campers. I didn't know anything about camping until I was, well in my 20s. But we would go to these places and we would walk trails. And these were, again, moments that really stuck in my memory and that were very peaceful for me.
Now, you come with a few advantages as an historian because you sort of kind of know, and particularly the kind of historian you are, and what you very much emphasize those stories that are quite accessible to the rest of us. This is a compliment to you, and you really know how to work the storytelling in the history. So for folks like your cousin, who's been quoted, you quoted as saying she didn't like history, she only bought your books to support you, but she reads your stuff because you know how to tell the story of history. So that said, you kind of can know what clues to look for to tell the stories of the main areas that you include in this book. And you have your personal experience, but I still want to know what was surprising to you about the work that you did in preparing to tell these three main stories.
Well, the first surprise I've already shared, which was that I was going to write about Louisa May Alcott. I'm still surprised that I wrote about Louisa May Alcott. She's not a figure who I had ever researched or studied in depth. And I was still more surprised when I began to research her, the things that I was learning about her that I didn't know. Alcott scholars would have known this. They would have known that Alcott wrote her diary and wrote in autobiographical reflections about her feeling of kinship, kind of inner kinship with boys and with wild animals like deer. I was surprised. I did not know that she had a very strong identification with people of other genders and with other kinds of animals. I kind of thought of Louisa May Alcott as the traditional Euro-American middle-class woman and writer. And she really was not that. She was very bold for her time. But she did have to kind of couch that boldness within the language and within the sensibility of her age. So it takes a little bit of kind of peeling back the layers to see it, but it is there. And I will say my next biggest surprise, and probably the most exciting surprise in this book, was the last chapter is about the Fort Shaw girls basketball team, a team made up of Indigenous girls who, through a number of different ways, were pushed, compelled, coerced, forced, encouraged. There are so many different ways they got there to attend a federal school for Native American children. This is one of those Indian boarding schools, as they were called. And these girls came from many different Indigenous nations across the U.S. West, especially from Montana and Idaho. And they spoke different languages. They went through, and also their brothers and their boy cousins who were there went through many of the difficulties and the shameful things that we now know took place in boarding school history. And nevertheless, they determined that they loved this new game of basketball. They became fantastic players of it. And they took every other team by storm who they played in basketball across the state of Montana. And then eventually they became the world champions. So the exciting thing about this part of the story, Callie, was when I was doing reading about this basketball team, the sources were saying that the boarding school they attended no longer existed, that it wasn't there anymore. But I love to visit historic sites, and I love to drag my family along. And so on one weekend, to drag my husband along, we went to the location because I just wanted to see what wasn't there. Like, if it wasn't there, I still wanted to see it. I wanted to see what the vista was like, what the view was like, how close the mountains were to their school. And it turns out that a portion of the school actually is still there, Callie, because the school was built on a U.S. Army installation. This also was not completely unusual.
Right.
So the school was built right under on the base. They're using those same military buildings, and those military buildings are still there. So the officers' quarters are there, and that's where the school administrators lived and where the teachers lived. And the bakehouse is still there, and the wash house is still there. And the river which is a place where some of the kids would try to run to escape that school, is of course still there. And I could stand on that campus and look to the river and see how those kids who were running away, who were trying to get back home to their reservations, may have felt that they had gone a very long way to that river, but in reality, it was just right on the edge of campus.
Well, we've heard that story and many enslaved stories, because nobody had a map at that point.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
The threads of all of your work usually include a focus on either Black women's lives or marginalized women's lives and themes of freedom and typically enslavement in some way. And this book does not disappoint in that way. And also revelatory in the way of putting these stories in a space where we can see women, particularly women, in bigger places in history than most people think they are. And I'm reminded that you founded a group for young women in Michigan called Echo Girls, which is really focused on, urban environments and getting those kids to really appreciate the outdoors and the environment. And that also speaks to, there may be myths and stereotypes about whose outdoors is it, I guess is the best way to put it. And that's really the essence of what you've put across here in these stories.
That's what I was hoping to do. I'm so glad that you read that in the book, Callie. I sometimes try to come at things indirectly, but one of the things that I want to put out there into our conversational space with this book was exactly that. Who's outside, who's outdoors is this? Well, of course, there's a very long history there, and I think it's critically important to always include Native American history in our interpretations and our narratives, because my view is that this is still Indigenous space. And at the same time, this is a space where we all live. This is a space that we all need, and it should belong to all of us. We should have access to public space. We should have access to beautiful spaces. We should have access to wildlands and to nature, and we shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable or policed or surveilled in those spaces. And this book is an attempt to say, look, some of the people who have been the most ignored and marginalized, such as children, girl children of color, girl children of color with chronic illnesses or disabilities, have also been outside doing remarkable things, learning about themselves and the world, pushing themselves, becoming smarter and stronger. And these are the very girls turned women who have helped to make tremendous strides in our society. And my thinking here is that if that was so important to them, it's probably just as important to any child today, no matter their gender identity or their category. And we don't know who the next Harriet Tubman is going to be. So we need to make sure that whoever she is or whoever they are, whoever he is, that they can have access to the outdoors, which transformed Tubman's life and her journey.
All right. In case everybody didn't hear me, we're back with my questions and your questions for Tiya. And we're going to start with Linda, whose question was upvoted by a number of people in the audience. And they want to know, what were some of your favorite books growing up?
I love that question. Oh my goodness. This is a chance for me to really raise two hands in thanks for all the teachers out there and to all the librarians out there, because I really think that my love of literature began in school. I remember a teacher in the 4th or 5th grade who read out loud to us every period from A Wrinkle in Time.
Wow.
And I looked forward to that period every day. Yes, imagine the patience. I fell in love with that book. And then I fell in love with Madeleine L'Engle, and I read all that series and every other series I could get my hands on that she wrote. And I remember taking the bus when I was a little bit older to one of our local libraries, to a branch, and reading a number of books there, again, by L'Engle, that I had been introduced to by my teacher. So I remember A Wrinkle in Time in that whole series. And of course, my kids and I were thrilled when the movie came out, because I had been foisting copies of A Wrinkle in Time and foisting, the trilogy on every gift I could think of for years. I remember The Secret Garden too, by Austin Burnett. I don't know how I got that book. I really have no idea. I can't imagine that I picked it, from a shelf, but I remember that book very clearly. And I remember Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, the Judy Blume and the Paula Danzigers. Those books for teens were books I always had my nose in. And I had the whole Trixie Belden series. And the Trixie Belden mystery series, you all, which I think maybe started being produced maybe in the 60s, something like that. I mean, they were an older series, but they were, I think, continued by different authors over time under one pen name. I didn't know any of this at the time. But I love Trixie Belden so much. And she lives in some beautiful town in New York. Where did she live? Somebody in this group knows where Trixie Belden lived. Put in the chat. But I loved her town. I loved her friendships and her solution of the mysteries. So my mother would give me a chance to buy one book. Sometimes we'd go to the bookstore. I could get one book, and I'd always get a new Trixie Belden mystery.
I love it. I always like to know the answer to that question either. All right, from Shay and Alicia, what other authors have inspired you historically or currently?
There are so many authors who have inspired me. I feel that any one of us who is engaged in thought work is standing on the shoulders of people who've come before us and people who join us in that endeavor. So one thing that I say, which I feel is absolutely true, is that there's never a single author of any book. Every single one of my books has been co-written by all the people who came before me and all the people who whispered in my ear. So I'll just mention a few people right now. I mean, Toni Morrison is someone who has inspired me as not only a fiction writer, but also a theorist and kind of a sociologist of human relations. I think that her work is brilliant and it extends into so many domains. And Alice Walker is the first author who really captured my imagination when it came to how the earth and how nature and how the living things are a vibrant part of our lives. And this is a part of all of Alice Walker's writing, even though maybe people don't think of her immediately as a nature writer first. I think she absolutely is. I loved Alice Walker's essays and poetry when I was in college, and still, I think, carry a kind of sensibility that she brought to that writing, to my own writing. And I'll just throw in one more name here, and that is Dorceta Taylor. Dorceta Taylor is a colleague. She is an academic. She's an environmental sociologist, teaches at Yale University, and she is very, very well known and lauded for the work she does on environmental sociology, environmental history, histories of environmental injustice. She's the person who really helped us to see that the politics of American conservation were rather skewed toward a certain ideal, which elevated one kind of population in the natural world, and that was white men, often white elite men who would go out and prove their masculinity in nature and then go home and write about it. And she showed how there were many other populations who also, of course, wanted to be outside, be in the natural world, we're in the natural world, but who were not only not imagined as part of this conservation vision, they were viewed as getting in the way of the conservation vision. because serve some kind of supposedly pristine wildland. What do you do when you come across the impoverished family who's living off the land there, no matter what their racial background? Because this includes indigenous people, this includes white Americans, people in rural life, across the board. That presents a conflict. So Rosita Taylor is somebody whose work I really admire, and she is the first person who I heard say that Harriet Tubman was an environmentalist. So she really for Wild Girls.
If people didn't get that, I would underscore that you have said that, and people don't expect it from a historian, that you take your inspiration from creative writers and poets. They're expecting you to do more Rosita Taylor and less Toni Morrison. And yet that's a place where you get a lot of inspiration. Okay, back to the questions. Aaron Lau, whoop, went away. There it is. Okay, I'm a youth of immigrant heritage at Wellesley College, and I want to ask you how you have found connection with new sites and landscapes and how you navigate familial connections with land. Let me just shout out Wellesley College, my alma mater.
Wellesley. So the question sounds like it's about new landscapes and how might an experience of movement or migration or immigration intersect with an experience of the landscape. This is such an important question. And I think it's a question that first of all, blows the lid off of assumptions that some people may have that anyone is always going to be static and in one place. I think all populations have to remake their sense of self, remake their definitions of community, remake how they live on the land and with the land as they move, as they migrate. So this is not an experience that is wholly unique to people who would identify as immigrants. Even indigenous peoples have migration stories, have moved across the landscape. And sometimes those stories were because of chosen movement. Sometimes they were because of forced movement, such as the period we know as, quote, Indian removal in US history, when the US government forcibly pushed nearly 80,000 indigenous peoples out of the Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and into what was then known as Indian territory. So populations move. And when people move, they do need to adjust their understanding of and interaction with the environment. And let me just tuck in here, Callie, that this is one thing that I find so beautiful about some of the early relationships between African peoples and indigenous peoples here in what is now the United States. Because, of course, African peoples were immigrants by force. They were taken from their homeland, forced to come to this country, didn't know anything about this place, and had to survive. And the things that they had been able to turn to in their home landscapes, they couldn't turn to in the same way in this new land. So, the sense of disorientation, the sense of dislocation, the sense of isolation, the challenge to identity that all that causes would have been, I think, very severe for them. But we do have examples in, especially the US Southeast, of African people of African descent, turning to indigenous people, indigenous Americans, to learn how to understand and interact with those landscapes. That was one of the most, I think, creative moments of encounter that we have in this country, those early interactions between African peoples and indigenous peoples, where African peoples were learning not how to make a basket, because of course they knew how to make baskets, but how to make a basket with these plants that grow down here on this coastline. And so I think that that was a long way around to say in response to the question. I think that my take on that is that we all need to readjust to our environments. We move, and we see right now that our environment is changing around us, even if we are living in the same place for a handful of years. And so this is a shared human experience. And people who are immigrants, should not feel that it's they alone that have to form new relationships with the land. It's really all of us.
Ellen Z wants to know, what was one of the greatest challenges you faced when writing and researching this book?
I think I've already probably addressed the greatest the greatest challenge, quite honestly, was working in a household where everybody was at home and it was very hard to get quiet space and get alone space and get thinking space. Another great challenge while working on this book was that many of the libraries and archives and places where you go to get information were actually not open. Mm-hmm. And so that took some waiting for things to open. That took some begging and requesting for very kind librarians and archivists to make the digital copies of things, which they generously did. But those were the two hardest things. Just the room of one's own, so to speak, to think and formulate the ideas, and also the ability to get into the archives and get into the repository where some of this material was held.
Okay. Sandy Thompson wants to know, what do you feel are the most effective ways we can support access to the outdoors?
Such a good question, and one that I have been thinking about. As far as the most effective ways go, which I want to try to go to first, I'm certainly not an expert in this space, but it seems to me that supporting the spaces that we already hold in common, public spaces, would be the most effective way. And that kind of support can range from being active in electoral politics and making sure that we are getting people into office who care about the common good, who care about public spaces, who care about trees. Trees are so important.
Trees are important.
And also to physical health. Trees should not be torn down. Old growth trees should not be torn down in our cities. That's kind of a little side note about current events. So I mean, the part of it, I think, is electoral politics, being active, trying to put people in office who can support this kind of a vision. Another part is really supporting these groups who are trying to not just protect and care for outdoor space, but to keep it open with our dollars. So that is, find an association that you think is caring for spaces outside. And that could be a national park, and it could also be a basketball court. That's one of the points I'm trying to make in this book, that there are many different kinds of outside. Urban outside is outside. It's just as much outside as rural outside, or national and state park outside. So finding an organization that you care about and supporting it with your funding, supporting it by showing up. I also think that if you have children or young people in your life, try to take them out. Try to take them out and expose them to the outdoors, because we do know that, again, there are all kinds of benefits to children's health, to their creativity, to their sense of well-being that come from being outside. And I will just share that sometimes I feel a little bit conflicted. People think that because I wrote this book, or because I talk about being outside, that I'm some kind of big hiker. I can get out there and hike 10 miles. That's really not me. I'm not some kind of accomplished outdoor person, but I really love and value the outdoors. And my husband and I have always tried to make sure that our kids get into the outdoors. And sometimes it's been awkward. When we were younger, taking our young kids out, I'm Black, my husband's Native American. We would get some stares and some looks. I'm not saying they were mean stares and looks, but they were stares and looks like, oh, what a surprise. And we do have a few stories which aren't quite so pleasant. We do have some stories of people questioning whether we actually paid our camping fee.
Wow.
Yes, I won't tell that one. But yes, these adventures aren't always so positive, and we have to work through the things outdoors that we still have to work through in any facet of society. But we have taken our kids out in these various ways that we've been able to over the years And I will just never forget how one day when one of our teens was feeling down, she just went out, and we actually weren't living in Massachusetts at the time. We were living in Montana for the year, and we were living by a place that was like a wide open field. And she just went out and she disappeared. And I panicked for a moment, thinking, what's happening and where has she gone? I don't even know if she knows this, but I sort of went out there to see where she was, and I found her just lying on her back in the tall grass. And I felt so happy and relieved and just glad that she was able to find a way to pick herself back up when she had been down, and that she found that way in nature. And I can't help but think that part of her ability to do that was because even though sometimes when she was younger, she didn't want to, we would get her on that trail.
But she got into it. Yeah. All right. Are you, from Bev, are you considering a sequel to this book to explore women of the 20th and 21st centuries that have been inspired by nature and the outdoors?
You're the second person that I know of who has brought that up. I think it was Bev, right? The second person who brought that up, and it's interesting because you can probably tell in this book that I maybe could have written a lot more about people like Grace Lee Boggs and Dolores Huerta, Octavia Butler, who I write about at the end. They're fascinating figures, and there are many more materials that could be brought to bear to think about their lives in the outdoors. So maybe, I mean, one of the, I think, wonderful things about this book, but also maybe one of the limited things about this book is that it is in a series called Norton Shorts.
Yes, that's right.
Norton Shorts.
Yeah.
So this book needs to be a certain number of pages, and I actually overwrote this book by about a chapter. There used to be a whole chapter about Sacagawea, and my editor gently reminded me, mostly through the power of her, that this must be a short book. So there's much more to be said, and I actually appreciate that encouragement to perhaps write more.
Now let's see. From Jane, how do you think that the focus on male participation in sports, especially in the pre-Title IX era, affected girls feeling comfortable being outside? When I was a young tomboy, in quotes, I spent a lot of my childhood playing games and sports outdoors, but didn't have many other reasons to be outside. And I was often the only girl or one of the few doing this while other girls were playing inside. How common was that historically, meaning before the 1940s, 50s, and 60s?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I have heard other people tell similar stories since I've been out talking about this book. There's a woman I was spending some time with during a recent trip down in Georgia who said that when she was young, she really loved to play baseball, but with her brothers, this is what she loved to do. But her father wouldn't let her because he said she might injure her female parts and not be able to have babies. And she said that she identified as a tomboy, and she was, she was a girl with a lot of spunk. And so she said to her dad, "Well, what about them? Are they going to injure their male parts, not be able to have babies?" But still, her argument didn't hold sway. So I think that we live in a culture in which, certainly in the 19th century and the early 20th, girls have been told that their place is in some manner of indoors. Now, this does differ depending upon the girls' racial backgrounds. It depends on their class context. A lot of the ideas that we have about girls, sitting on the couch with doilies is an image of a more middle class aspiring kind of household. But even for girls who were poorer or who were working class and who had to perhaps work outside, physically to help their families get along, were expected to comport themselves in certain feminized ways, which impressed upon them the need to control their bodies, to kind of pull it all in, right? And to and to move with a sense of modesty, and to not relish the outdoors. Having to go is one thing, but going out, running as hard as you can, pumping your legs, throwing your arms out, getting dirty, getting messy, certainly not encouraged for girls. And I think that it makes a tremendous difference that girls' athletics has now been somewhat equalized to men's athletics, and that girls can see that there's a space for them there. But I will just throw in here that I hadn't thought of this before at this very moment in our conversation, but I played soccer throughout most of my girlhood. And that's because, I don't know what put it in my head, but my father took me to a soccer game once and suggested I might want to play. I was very young, I think maybe first grade or something. And I played on a girls' soccer team for a very long time. And that experience was so important for me in terms of developing just a sense of physical self-possession, the ability to be in your body and to move and to try to shake off that feeling that girls, I think, are often taught to have, that you have to be pretty, you have to be attractive, so you shouldn't be sweaty and a mess and all kinds of things that you have to be when you're out there in competitive sports. And so I think that we have come quite a long way when it comes to these expectations of what girls can do with their bodies and where and how. But at the same time, I really do worry that shared cultural spaces like social media are still projecting, and in a very amplified way, images of what a girl should be like or look like that are actually not favoring the sense of self-possessed physicality.
Well, I'll just note, I interviewed a woman who did a fantastic book about the history of women and exercise. And the prevailing opinion was that competitive marathon runners would lose their uterus if they ran. Just saying. All right, here we go. Lisa wants to know, what are you working on now?
This is not going to surprise a single one of you all, that I am working on a biography of Harriet Tubman.
Oh, very good.
Because again, this had to be a very short book, and it also had a thematic focus. I wanted to focus on the girlhood experiences, and for each of the figures, I do kind of trace them into their adulthood and talk about the connection between what they experienced as girls and what they did as women. But really, the focus was on the girlhood stories. And Harriet Tubman lived a very long life and did quite a lot of things, as we know. Yes, she did, as an adult. So that's what I'm working on now, continuing to really think about the environmental theme.
Including being a scout. Okay, last question. Sorry, people. Are there characteristics of some public green spaces that make them more welcoming or special than others? What might those be? Thank you. That's from Christina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I mentioned early in the conversation when I was sharing some things about my childhood that I have tended to gravitate toward trees. And I think that's just a personality quirk. Yeah, other people here probably do too, or maybe some people gravitate toward water or the grass or rocks. We all have our own affinities. But I was really surprised to learn in doing some of the research for Wild Girls that trees do have a special kind of impact on our lives. That trees seem to be the most soothing kind of outdoor environment. And so I would say that when it comes to outdoor spaces, we really need to have trees. We really need to have green. I remember back when I was working on this group that Callie mentioned called Eco Girls, which stands for Environmental and Cultural Opportunities for Girls, coming across a study that talked about how students who were living in really a very concrete-based low-income housing development, if they had a view through their window of green space, they did better in school. They were able to concentrate better and to study better. And so trees are important and green is important. And I would want us to start there.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us. right through your illness. You're a trooper. Thank you so much. You are Harriet Tubman, reincarnated.
Y'all wish we could join her, don't we? In that
Um,
magisterial fight.
there you go.
And we
Time
have,
for us
let
to
me
wrap
just
up.
think,
Um,
we have a big fight ahead of us right now. And I think Tubman should be our model.
yeah, I think I would agree with you. Good note to end on. Thank you, Tiya. So it was a pleasure. We all had enjoyed this conversation with Tiya. Good night, everyone.